When most people think of world wars, their minds immediately jump to the two devastating conflicts of the 20th century, World War I and World War II. But long before the trenches of Europe or the bombing raids over cities, there was a war that spanned continents, empires, and oceans, a conflict so vast and interconnected that historians often call it the first truly global war. This was the 7 Years' War, fought between 1756 and 1763, a struggle that would reshape the balance of power across Europe, North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and India. It began, in many ways, with a relatively small territorial dispute on the frontiers of North America, yet it quickly escalated into a full-scale war involving some of the greatest powers of the 18th century: Great Britain, France, Austria, Prussia, Russia, Spain, Portugal, and Sweden. Countless local allies, from Native American tribes to Indian princely states, were drawn into the conflict, each seeking to protect their interests or expand their influence. What started as a regional skirmish ultimately determined who would dominate the European continent and who would control the colonies that fueled empires. But how did such a sprawling, global conflict come to pass? How did a fight over territory in a sparsely populated forest in Pennsylvania spark a war that would echo in India, the Caribbean, and across the seas? The answers lie in a tangled web of alliances, rivalries, and the ambitions of rulers who saw the world as a chessboard to be conquered. The 7 Years' War was more than just battles and treaties. It was a collision of emerging empires, a war of finance and trade, and a contest for control over the seas and the riches of far-off lands. It produced legendary military leaders like Frederick the Great of Prussia and Robert Clive of the British East India Company, whose decisions would shape the future of nations. It also set the stage for revolutions, colonial rebellions, and global realignments that would define the modern world. Over the next several minutes, we will journey from the battlefields of Europe to the forests of North America, from the sugar islands of the Caribbean to the bustling ports of India. We will uncover the causes, the strategies, the victories, and the defeats of a war that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and altered the fate of empires. This is the history of the real First World War, a story of ambition, betrayal, and the struggle for global dominance. To understand the outbreak of the 7 Years' War, we must first look back at the tangled alliances, dynastic rivalries, and territorial disputes that had dominated European politics for decades. The mid-18th century was a time when the map of Europe was constantly shifting, and the ambitions of kings, queens, and ministers often dictated the fates of millions. At the heart of the tensions were the two dynastic powerhouses, the Bourbon kings of France and the Habsburg rulers of Austria. For over half a century, these two families had struggled to assert dominance across Europe, engaging in repeated conflicts to secure territory, influence, and prestige. Their rivalries were amplified by the network of alliances that had governed European politics since the late 17th century. The War of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748, which had erupted over the question of who should inherit the Austrian throne, had left unresolved tensions. Empress Maria Theresa had secured her crown, but at the cost of territorial losses, most notably the prosperous province of Silesia, which had passed to Frederick the Great of Prussia. While the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748 formally ended the conflict, it did little to settle the underlying disputes. Austria remained bitter over the loss of Silesia, France still sought to check British and Austrian influence, and Britain wanted to safeguard its continental and colonial interests. By the mid-1750s, the old alliance system began to unravel. Britain had traditionally aligned with Austria to contain France's expansion, but disputes over Hanover, British-German possession, created tensions between the two allies. Empress Maria Theresa, unsatisfied with Britain's inability to secure Austrian territories and infuriated over perceived British concessions to France, sought a new approach. In a bold diplomatic shift, often called the Diplomatic Revolution, Austria broke from its traditional ally Britain and moved closer to France, the very power it had long opposed. Meanwhile, Britain, needing a reliable ally to defend Hanover against potential French aggression, turned to Prussia. Frederick the Great, ambitious and militarily talented, was eager to consolidate his hold over Silesia and expand his influence in Central Europe. In a secret alliance, Britain promised financial and military support to Prussia, while Prussia pledged to defend Hanover from French threats. This alignment set the stage for a continental conflict that would soon spill into colonies around the world. Europe was not the only stage for rising tensions. The 18th century had seen an explosion of colonial ambitions, particularly between Britain and France. Both nations sought to dominate trade routes, resources, and overseas territories, often deploying private armies under the guise of trading companies. In India, the British and French East India Companies vied for influence among local rulers, establishing fortified trading posts and recruiting soldiers to protect their interests. These skirmishes, known as the Carnatic Wars, were localized, but foreshadowed the global reach the conflict would soon assume. In North America, the tensions were even more immediate. By the mid-18th century, the British had established the 13 colonies along the eastern seaboard, stretching from Georgia to Maine, as well as Canadian territories like Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. The French controlled vast expanses along the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, and the Mississippi River Basin, building forts to prevent British expansion. One of the most contentious points was the Ohio River Valley, a sparsely populated region where both powers claimed authority. The situation reached a breaking point in 1754 when a young George Washington, then a 21-year-old lieutenant colonel in the Virginia Regiment, led a small contingent of colonial troops to confront the French at Fort Duquesne. A skirmish at Jumonville Glen and a subsequent defeat at Fort Necessity marked the opening shots of what would become known in North America as the French and Indian War, but globally as the spark of the 7 Years' War. This escalation was fueled not only by territorial disputes, but also by competing visions of empire, trade, and power. While Europe debated over alliances, the conflict was already spreading across continents. French and British ambitions in the Caribbean, Africa, and India created flashpoints that would draw in more nations, turning a regional struggle into a world war. By 1756, the stage was set: a divided Europe, simmering colonial rivalries, and an intricate web of alliances and enmities. The world was on the brink of a conflict unlike any before it, one that would involve armies and navies across every ocean, claim hundreds of thousands of lives, and redefine the geopolitical landscape for decades. By 1756, tensions that had been simmering for years finally boiled over into open warfare. What began as regional skirmishes between colonial powers in North America rapidly expanded into a full-scale conflict across Europe, laying the foundations of the first truly global war. In Europe, the friction between Prussia and Austria became the immediate trigger. Frederick the Great, ever ambitious, sought to consolidate his hold over Silesia, the province he had seized from Austria in the previous war. His strategy was preemptive. He launched an invasion of Saxony in August 1756, aiming to strike decisively before Austrian and Russian forces could fully mobilize. However, Frederick's plans did not unfold as smoothly as hoped. The Battle of Lobositz on October 1, 1756, saw 33,000 Austrian troops under General Maximilian Ulysses repel the Prussian advance. This engagement, though not catastrophic, forced Frederick to devote the next year to trying to break through Austrian defenses in Bohemia. The Battle of Prague in May 1757 and the Battle of Kolin in June 1757 further demonstrated the resilience of Austria, halting Prussian progress and keeping the continent embroiled in stalemate. While Frederick struggled on land, the French and British clashed indirectly through their allies. France, seeing an opportunity to weaken Britain's continental position, marched into Hanover, capturing significant portions of King George II's German holdings. The young Duke of Cumberland, leading Hanoverian troops, was unable to prevent the occupation. Meanwhile, Russian forces advanced into East Prussia, threatening the very heart of Frederick's realm. Sweden, sensing weakness, declared war on Prussia and invaded Pomerania. By the end of 1757, Frederick faced a crisis. He was fighting a multi-front war against Austria, Russia, France, and Sweden, with Prussian forces outnumbered and stretched thin. Yet Frederick's military genius became evident in what historians later called the miracle of the campaigns. In November 1757, he decisively defeated a combined French-German army at the Battle of Rossbach, despite being outnumbered nearly 2-1. The following month, he routed a numerically superior Austrian force at the Battle of Leuthen, solidifying his reputation as one of Europe's greatest commanders. By turning north and pushing the Swedes back from Pomerania, Frederick temporarily stabilized Prussia's precarious position. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic in North America, tensions between Britain and France had escalated beyond small frontier skirmishes. The French and Indian War became the American theater of the 7 Years' War. Early French successes included the capture of Fort Oswego in 1756 and Fort William Henry in 1757, showcasing the strategic advantage of their fortified positions and alliances with various Native American groups. The British, however, began to leverage their larger population and mobilized colonial forces. By the late 1750s, the British colonies numbered around 2 million, while New France had barely 100,000 inhabitants, giving Britain a significant manpower advantage. With reinforcements and coordination under the leadership of figures like Major General Edward Braddock and later Pete the Elder, Britain shifted from a defensive to an offensive posture. Braddock's initial expedition to retake Fort Duquesne ended disastrously, with Braddock mortally wounded, but it provided hard lessons in colonial warfare that informed subsequent British campaigns. A turning point came in 1758, when the British, under Pitt's strategy, aimed to weaken France, not on European battlefields alone, but by attacking its valuable overseas colonies. Caribbean islands like Guadeloupe and Martinique, key producers of sugar and wealth for France, became prime targets. Despite challenges including tropical disease and logistical difficulties, British forces captured Guadeloupe in early 1759 and eventually Martinique by 1762, striking a significant blow to French economic interests. India emerged as another critical front. The British and French East India Companies had already been engaging in localized conflicts, but in 1757, the Battle of Plassey transformed British fortunes. Robert Clive, commanding a relatively small British force alongside local allies, defeated a much larger army under the Bengal ruler with French support. This victory secured British control over Bengal, marking the beginning of the expansion of British influence across the Indian subcontinent and the decline of French power in the region. Back in Europe, the tides were equally dynamic. Russia initially pressed its advantage against Prussia, capturing East Prussia and threatening Frederick's core territories. However, the sudden death of Empress Elizabeth in January 1762, followed by the accession of Peter III, a Prussian sympathizer, shifted the balance. Russia withdrew from the war, aligning with Prussia and Britain, relieving Frederick from multi-front pressure and allowing him to regain lost territories.